The last functioning light in corridor C-17 flickered desperately, casting angular shadows across the rust-stained walls of Citadel 9. Frank Mercer slouched in his chair, the blue glow of ancient monitors reflecting off his unshaven face. His cramped office, once a storage closet for maintenance supplies, had become his sanctuary in this dying space station. The station's life support systems wheezed like an old man with failing lungs, pipes knocking and hissing as recycled air pushed through decaying vents. "Archive retrieval complete," announced the station's AI in its monotone voice. "Records indicate 14 supply manifests between stellar dates 37742 and 307756. Frank rubbed his bloodshot eyes. Another day, another pointless data retrieval job for station management who barely acknowledged his existence. The word archivist on his faded ID badge had once meant something to him. Now it was just a title that justified his continued residence on this forgotten hulk floating at the edge of civilized space. "Display manifest anomalies," he muttered, more out of habit than curiosity. No one cared about inconsistencies in cargo manifests from 3 months ago. No one cared about much of anything on Citadel 9 anymore. The screens flickered as data scrolled past. Numbers, codes, shipping containers, all blurring together in a meaningless parade. Frank reached for his thermos of synthetic coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. The liquid had gone cold hours ago. His mind drifted back to the incident that had landed him here. The evacuation of Proxima Station during the reactor breach. He'd been security then, responsible for Sector 7, where the children's quarters were located. But when the alarms blared and panic ensued, he'd hesitated. Just 90 seconds of paralysis, but it had cost one child his life. The official inquiry had cleared him of negligence. But Frank knew the truth. He'd failed, and the guilt had hollowed him out, leaving a shell that now catalogued shipping manifests on a dying station. A burst of static erupted from his console, startling him from his reverie. The communications panel lit up with an emergency frequency, unusual for this sector. Frank frowned, adjusting the controls to clear the signal. "Please, anyone," a woman's voice, breaking through layers of interference. "My daughter. Taken. I'll give anything. Reward you with my body. Just find her." The transmission cut off abruptly. Frank sat up straight, his lethargy evaporating. The voice had been desperate, pained, and those last words, "reward you with my body," they stirred something in him, not just base desire, but a primal instinct to respond to genuine distress. He ran a trace on the signal. Section D8, an abandoned maintenance level. No one should be there. It had been sealed off after a micrometeoroid breach 2 years ago. Frank hesitated, his hand hovering over the alert button that would summon station security. But something stopped him. Security on Citadel 9 was a joke. A handful of bored officers who spent more time gambling than patrolling, and if someone was in trouble. Before he could reconsider, Frank grabbed his utility belt and emergency kit. The corridor outside his office stretched before him, emergency lights casting a sickly amber glow on metal walls. The route to D8 would take him through rarely used service tunnels and past the station's massive water reclamation tanks. No one would notice his absence. No one would care. As Frank descended through the levels of the station, the temperature dropped. His breath clouded before him, and the constant mechanical hum that pervaded the inhabited sections faded to an eerie silence. D8 had been cold-stored, its life support systems operating at minimal capacity just to prevent the pipes from freezing. The service hatch to D8 was sealed with a security lock, but Frank's archivist credentials overrode it. The metal door groaned as it slid open, revealing a darkened corridor beyond. Frank activated his flashlight, the beam cutting through darkness thick as tar. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing down the empty corridor. "I received your transmission. I'm here to help." No response. Frank moved cautiously forward, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across abandoned equipment and frost-covered walls. Something gleamed on the floor ahead, a smear of liquid reflecting his light. He approached slowly, then froze. Blood, but not red, a vibrant azure blue that seemed to shimmer with an inner phosphorescence. Xenobiological blood. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. The transmission hadn't come from a human woman. It had come from an alien, one of the countless species that passed through Citadel 9's docking ports but rarely ventured into the station itself. A soft moan from a nearby maintenance room drew his attention. Frank approached cautiously, flashlight illuminating the entrance to a small chamber filled with deactivated cleaning drones. Slumped against one wall was a figure. She was humanoid, with slender limbs and delicate features, but her skin was a pale blue that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Silver-white hair fell in tangled waves past her shoulders. Her clothing, a simple jumpsuit of some iridescent material, was torn at the shoulder, revealing a deep wound that leaked azure blood. Her eyes fluttered open as his light fell upon her face. Eyes with no whites, just deep purple irises that took up the entire socket. Those alien eyes focused on him with startling clarity. "You came," she whispered, her voice melodious despite the pain evident in her expression. "You heard me." Frank knelt beside her, already reaching for the medical kit at his belt. "Don't move. You're injured." "My daughter." She grasped his wrist with surprising strength. "They took my daughter. She's only 6 cycles old. Please, I'll give you anything, my body, my possessions. Just help me find her." Frank felt a surge of emotion he hadn't experienced in years, a protective instinct, a sense of purpose. "Let me treat your wound first," he said firmly. "Then we'll talk about your daughter." The alien woman, Varelion, she later told him, had been smuggled aboard Citadel 9 along with her daughter Aliyah. They were refugees from the Cygnus conflict, fleeing the devastation of their home world after Varelion's husband had been executed by opposing forces. They had paid exorbitant fees to a transport captain who promised safe passage to the Outer Rim colonies. Instead, he had delivered them to Dro Karen, a notorious trafficker who operated in the shadows of Citadel 9's neglected sectors. "He separated us as soon as we arrived," Varelion explained, wincing as Frank applied a regenerative gel to her wound. They had relocated to his quarters, a small but secure room that offered privacy from the station's omnipresent surveillance systems. "Said Aliyah needed medical screening. When I protested, his guards attacked me. I managed to escape. But they have my daughter." Frank accessed his terminal, fingers flying across the keyboard. "Dro Karen," he muttered. "I've heard rumors, but station security claims they've found no evidence of trafficking operations. Because they're paid to look the other way," Varelion said bitterly. "On many stations. This is the way. The powerful protect each other." Frank nodded grimly. Corruption was the one constant across the galaxy, regardless of species or political systems. "We need to find out where they might be keeping your daughter. Recent cargo manifests might give us a clue. Can you access them?" Varelion moved to stand beside him, her alien scent, something like cinnamon and ozone, filling his nostrils. "I'm the station archivist. I can access everything." Frank pulled up the records for the past week, scanning for anomalies. "Look for anything labeled specialized cargo or biological samples. Those are common euphemisms for living contraband." Varelion leaned closer, her silver hair brushing against his shoulder. "There," she pointed to an entry from 2 days prior. "Cargo juvenile. Section F. Crate 6C. That could be her." Frank studied the entry. It's suspicious that it's labeled so explicitly. Traffickers usually use more obscure coding. He continued scrolling. "Wait, look at this pattern." He highlighted a series of entries that showed identical cargo weights and handling instructions, but with different destination codes. "Duplicate records," he explained. "One set for official inspection, another for the actual operations. It's a classic deception technique." He smiled grimly. But they didn't count on someone actually comparing the datasets. Can you determine which is real? Varelion's voice was tense with hope. Frank's fingers tapped rapidly. Not directly, but we can eliminate possibilities. According to the official record, Crate 6C was transferred to long-term storage in Warehouse 17, but the shadow record shows it being moved to a private holding facility in Section X9. X9? Varelion frowned. Is that far? It's off-grid, Frank explained. A section that officially doesn't exist on station maps. It was constructed after the last official redesign and never registered with central authority. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair. Getting there won't be easy. It's beyond the regular patrol routes, but that means heavy private security. I don't care about the risks. Varelion's eyes flashed with determination. She's my daughter. I would walk through fire to find her. Frank looked at this alien woman, wounded and desperate on a hostile station, willing to offer her body to a stranger just for the chance to save her child. Something stirred in him, a sense of purpose he'd thought had died years ago on Proxima Station. We'll need to be smart about this, he said finally. Direct confrontation with Dro Karen's security would be suicide. We need to gather more intelligence first, find a weakness in their operation. Varelion nodded, her expression fierce. Tell me what to do. Frank accessed the station's maintenance schedule. We'll start by getting eyes on Warehouse 17 and Section X9, verify which records are accurate. He pointed to a schematic of the station's ventilation system. These maintenance tunnels will get us close without triggering security sensors. As they prepared for their reconnaissance mission, Frank found himself studying Varelion. Despite her alien features, her emotions were startlingly human. The worry etched into her face, the determined set of her jaw, the occasional trembling of her hands when she spoke of her daughter. Tell me about Aaliyah, he said as he packed a small bag with surveillance equipment and emergency rations. Varelion's expression softened. She's quiet, but observant, always watching, learning. She reached into a hidden pocket in her jumpsuit and withdrew a small square of fabric, intricately embroidered with geometric patterns and shimmering thread. She carries this everywhere, a piece of our homeworld. I taught her our traditional weaving patterns when she was just 4 cycles old. Frank examined the fabric, impressed by the complexity of the design. It's beautiful. In our culture, these patterns tell stories. Varelion explained, her finger tracing one particular motif. This represents protection, a mother's embrace around her child. Her voice caught. I failed in that protection. We'll find her, Frank said with a conviction that surprised him. The ventilation tunnels of Citadel 9 formed a labyrinthine network throughout the station. Narrow metal passages barely wide enough for a human to crawl through. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of industrial lubricants. Frank led the way, Varelion close behind, both of them moving as quietly as possible. Security drones patrol these tunnels every 4 hours, Frank whispered over his shoulder. We need to time our movements carefully. They reached a junction where the tunnel widened slightly, allowing them to pause and check the station schematics on Frank's portable display. Warehouse 17 should be directly below us, he said, indicating a large storage area on the map. There's an observation grill about 20 meters ahead. They continued forward, the metal beneath their hands and knees uncomfortably cold. Finally, they reached the grill, a ventilation cover that looked down into a cavernous space filled with shipping containers stacked 3 high. I don't see any guards, Varelion whispered, peering through the slats. They use automated security here, Frank explained, pointing to small spherical drones that hovered at regular intervals throughout the warehouse. Motion detectors and thermal scanners, but they're looking for intruders on the warehouse floor, not in the ventilation system. He activated a small device that projected a holographic overlay onto the view below, highlighting container 6C in red. There it is. 3rd row. 2nd level. Varelion's breath caught. Can we get to it? Frank studied the security patterns for several minutes. Yes, but we'll need a distraction for the drones. He reached into his pack and removed a small mechanical device. This will simulate a minor coolant leak on the far side of the warehouse. The drones will investigate, giving us about 3 minutes to check the container. They waited for the next patrol cycle to complete. Then Frank activated the device, sending it skittering across the warehouse ceiling to the far wall. Moments later, a soft hissing sound filled the air, and white vapor began spilling from a small vent. As predicted, the security drones immediately converged on the apparent malfunction. Now, Frank said, quickly removing the grill and securing a thin cable to the frame. They slid down to the warehouse floor, landing softly between tall stacks of containers. Container 6C was a standard cargo unit, 3 meters long and sealed with a biometric lock. Frank attached a bypass module to the control panel, and after 30 seconds of electronic negotiation, the lock disengaged with a soft click. The door swung open to reveal nothing. The container was completely empty. I don't understand, Varelion said, her voice tight with frustration. The records said. The records lied, Frank replied grimly, running his hand along the interior walls. Or rather, both sets of records lied. This confirms my suspicion. Dro Karen's operation is sophisticated enough to plant false leads in both the official and shadow systems. A distant alarm began to sound, and the security drones started to return from the false coolant leak. We need to go, Frank urged, already moving toward their entry point. They climbed back into the ventilation shaft just as the drones reached their position. The grill secured behind them seconds before a scanning beam swept the area. Back in Frank's quarters, they reassessed their strategy. Varelion paced the small room, her frustration palpable. If both records are false, how will we ever find her? She asked, her voice cracking with emotion. Frank studied the station schematics, mind racing through possibilities. We need to think like Dro Karen, he said finally. If I were running a trafficking operation on a station with multiple layers of security and documentation, how would I track my inventory? He grimaced at the clinical term for living beings. You would need a system that couldn't be accessed by station personnel, Varelion suggested, but that your own people could reference securely. Exactly. Frank nodded. And you wouldn't use the station's regular communications channels. Too easily monitored. He pulled up a diagnostic of Citadel 9's power grid. But you would need power for your facilities. He highlighted a section of the grid showing unexpected power consumption in an allegedly unused area. There, Section X9 is drawing significant power despite being officially decommissioned. And look at the pattern, consistent with life support systems for multiple occupants. Varelion leaned closer. That must be where they're keeping the captives. Likely, Frank agreed. But we still need to identify which container or cell might hold Aaliyah specifically. We can't just break in and search randomly. We'd be caught within minutes. Varelion withdrew the embroidered fabric square again, running her fingers over the patterns. On our world, mothers and daughters often share pattern signatures in their weaving, a genetic imprint of sorts. She pointed to a specific motif. This one contains elements of both my pattern and Aaliyah's. It's unique to our lineage. Frank studied the intricate design, an idea forming. Could this pattern be used as a form of identification, something that would respond to your daughter's presence? Yes. Varelion's eyes widened. The threads we use are partially biological, containing trace elements of our DNA. They respond subtly to the presence of related individuals, a warm glow only visible to our species. She looked at him intently. But how does that help us? Biometric signatures, Frank explained, excitement building in his voice. Dro Karen's operation needs to track their captives. Without using standard identification systems, They might be using biological markers unique to each individual. He turned back to his terminal. If we can identify the specific markers they're using for Aaliyah, we can trace her location within their facility. He began a deep search of the shadow records, looking for biometric data rather than container numbers or locations. After hours of sifting through encrypted data, he found a promising lead. "Look at this." He pointed to a series of coded entries. These aren't standard cargo identifiers. They're biological signature codes, unique genetic markers for different species. "Can you isolate Aaliyah's?" Varelian asked anxiously. Frank's fingers flew across the keyboard. "I'm cross-referencing with known xenobiological profiles. Your species has distinctive markers in the cellular structure. If I filter for juvenile parameters." A single entry illuminated on the screen. "There," Frank said softly. "Biological signature C271J. Location, Section X9. Containment, Cell 14. He looked up at Varelion, whose eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "We've found her." The journey to Section X9 required navigating through the most neglected parts of Citadel 9, areas where the station's deterioration was most evident. Exposed wiring hung from ceiling panels, and pools of condensation gathered on the corroded floor plates. They moved cautiously, avoiding the occasional security drone and utilizing Frank's knowledge of blind spots in the surveillance system. "The entrance to X9 should be through that maintenance hatch," Frank whispered, indicating a heavy metal door at the end of a dimly lit corridor. "It'll have biometric security, handprint scanners, retinal verification." "How do we bypass that?" Varelian asked. Frank removed a small device from his pack. "This scrambler will confuse the sensors just long enough for us to slip through during a reset cycle, but once we're inside, we'll have limited time before the system flags the anomaly." They approached the hatch cautiously. Frank attached the scrambler to the control panel and activated it. The security display flickered, then went dark momentarily before rebooting. "Now," Frank urged, pulling the door open. They slipped through into a sterile, white corridor that contrasted sharply with the decrepit passages they'd just traversed. Here, everything was clean, modern, and well-maintained. A secret facility hidden within the decaying station. 14 cells down this corridor," Frank whispered, consulting his portable display. "Security cameras every 10 meters, and likely motion sensors in the floor. How do we avoid detection?" Varelion's voice was barely audible. Frank pointed to service panels running along the ceiling. "Maintenance crawl space. It'll be tight, but we can move above the sensors." They accessed the crawl space through a utility panel, squeezing into a narrow passage filled with bundled cables and junction boxes. Inch by inch, they made their way forward, Frank counting the cell numbers visible through small inspection ports in the floor of the crawl space. "Cell 14, he finally whispered, pointing to a port directly beneath them. Through it, they could see a small room with a single cot. On it lay a small figure, curled into a fetal position, a child with the same pale blue skin as Varelion, but with darker silver-blue hair. "Aaliyah," Varelion gasped, her whole body trembling. Frank studied the cell's security measures. "Electronic lock, but it's connected to the central system. If I override it from here, it'll trigger alarms throughout the facility." "What do we do?" Varelion's eyes never left her daughter's form. "We need a distraction larger than before," Frank said grimly. "Something that will force them to open all the cells." He thought for a moment, then accessed the station schematics on his display. "The environmental systems. If I trigger a false fire alert in this section, the automatic protocols will unlock all containment areas for evacuation." "Won't that bring security running?" "Yes, but they'll be focused on containing the non-existent fire and managing evacuation procedures. It's our best chance to grab Aaliyah and escape in the confusion." Frank accessed the environmental control systems through his portable terminal, using his archivist credentials to bypass the initial security layers. as he worked to program the false alert. Footsteps echoed in the corridor below. They froze, watching through the inspection port as a figure approached cell 14. It was a hulking humanoid with mottled green skin and a face ridged with bony protrusions. A draconian, most likely Dro Karen himself. He carried an electrified baton and stopped outside Aaliyah's cell, activating the intercom. "Up. Merchandise," he growled in a guttural voice. "Inspection time." On the cot, Aaliyah stirred, raising her head fearfully. Even from their limited vantage point, Frank could see the bruise that marred one side of her delicate face. Beside him, Varelion made a sound, half gasp, half growl, and before he could stop her, she had shoved open the inspection port and dropped through the opening, landing directly on Dro Karen's broad shoulders. The trafficker roared in surprise and anger, trying to dislodge Varelion as she clawed at his face. Aiming for his yellow eyes, the electronic baton fell from his hand, skittering across the floor. Frank cursed under his breath and followed Varelion through the opening, landing awkwardly beside the struggling pair. He lunged for the fallen baton, grabbing it just as Dro Karen threw Varelion against the wall with brutal force. The alien woman crumpled to the floor, momentarily stunned. Dro Karen turned toward Frank, snarling. "You're dead! Human! Both of you!" Frank activated the baton, its tip crackling with electric energy. "Back away from them," he demanded, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The trafficker laughed, a harsh sound like grinding metal. "You don't know how to use that. Archivist. I can smell your fear." He was right. Frank had never wielded such a weapon. But as Dro Karen lunged toward him, Frank remembered the circuit diagrams he'd studied during his initial training as a station security officer. The baton was essentially a directed energy conduit with a safety limiter. In one desperate motion, Frank twisted the base of the baton, disengaging the limiter, and thrust it toward the exposed power conduit in the wall behind Dro Karen. The resulting energy surge knocked them both backward as electricity arced through the corridor. The lights flickered, then died, plunging them into darkness broken only by emergency lighting. Station alarms began blaring, and automated announcements echoed through the corridors. "Environmental hazard detected in Section X9. Emergency protocols engaged. All containment areas unlocking for evacuation." Frank staggered to his feet, ears ringing from the explosion. Dro Karen lay motionless on the floor, the smell of burnt flesh filling the air. The cell door slid open automatically, and Aaliyah emerged cautiously, her purple eyes wide with fear. Varelion pushed herself up from where she'd fallen, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. When she saw her daughter, she gave a cry of joy and rushed forward, gathering the child in her arms. They clung to each other, Varelion murmuring words in their native language as she stroked Aaliyah's hair. "We need to move," Frank urged, already hearing the pounding of security boots in distant corridors. "The station will be on full lockdown soon." They fled through the now open corridors of Section X9, Frank leading them toward an emergency evacuation route he'd identified in the station schematics. Around them, other cells had opened, releasing confused and frightened captives of various species. The resulting chaos provided perfect cover for their escape. They navigated through maintenance tunnels and service corridors, avoiding the main thoroughfares where security would be concentrated. Frank's intimate knowledge of the station's layout proved invaluable as they evaded pursuit, working their way toward the lower docking levels. "Where are we going?" Varelion asked, carrying Aaliyah, who had not spoken a word since her rescue, her small arms wrapped tightly around her mother's neck. "Cargo Bay 12, Frank replied, checking his portable display for security patrol patterns. "There's a supply transport scheduled to depart in 40 minutes, if we can get aboard." "They'll be checking all outgoing vessels," Varelion pointed out. "Not thoroughly," Frank countered. "Not with the chaos we've created. and I can alter the manifest to include 3 maintenance workers being transferred to the next station." They reached a junction where 2 corridors intersected, and Frank held up his hand, signaling them to stop. A security drone hovered at the far end of the corridor they needed to traverse. "Wait here," he whispered, ducking into a nearby utility closet. He emerged moments later with a small electronic device. "Maintenance override transmitter. It'll make the drone think we're authorized personnel." They continued forward, the drone scanning them briefly before moving on to continue its patrol. 3 more security checkpoints were navigated with similar tactics. Frank's years of observing the station's operations now paying dividends in their escape. Cargo. Bay 12 was a hive of activity. Workers loading the last containers onto a battered transport vessel. Frank led them to a service entrance, where he accessed a terminal to create their false work orders. "Maintenance transfer to Uran's Hope," he muttered as he typed. "Priority level 2, authorized by Operations Chief Markin." He glanced at Varelion and Aliyah, considering. "I'll need to alter your appearances slightly. The facial recognition systems will be on high alert." From his pack, he produced compact breathers that would cover the lower half of their faces, and caps to hide their distinctive hair. For Aliyah, he fashioned a small coverall from a maintenance jumpsuit, rolling up the sleeves and legs to fit her tiny frame. "Remember, your maintenance workers being transferred because of the environmental emergency in Section X9, he instructed as they approached the loading dock supervisor, a bored-looking human with cybernetic enhancements visible at his temples. The supervisor barely glanced at their documentation before waving them through, more concerned with the shipping containers being loaded than with 3 insignificant workers. They boarded the transport through the crew entrance, Frank leading them to a small maintenance compartment near the engine room where the constant hum of machinery would mask any sounds they might make. The space was cramped and hot, but it offered concealment for the 12-hour journey to Uran's Hope. As the transport rumbled to life, vibrations shuddering through the metal walls around them, Frank allowed himself to relax marginally. They weren't safe yet, wouldn't be until they were well away from Citadel 9's jurisdiction, but they had cleared the most dangerous hurdle. Varelion sat with her back against the wall. Aliyah curled in her lap. The child had still not spoken, but her eyes followed Frank's movements with solemn intensity. "Thank you," Varelion said softly, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. "I had given up hope until you answered my call." Frank shook his head, uncomfortable with gratitude he wasn't sure he deserved. "I didn't do it for—" he began, then stopped himself. Why had he done it? Not for the promised reward. Certainly. Perhaps for redemption, a chance to save a child when he had failed before. Or perhaps simply because, in a station full of people who looked the other way, he had chosen not to. "I'm glad I could help," he said finally. They fell into silence, the rhythm of the engines lulling them. After some time, Aliyah stirred in her mother's arms and reached into her pocket, withdrawing the small square of embroidered fabric Varelion had shown Frank earlier. The child studied it intently, then looked up at Frank with those large, purple eyes. "You're like this pattern," she said, her voice small but clear, surprising both adults. She pointed to a complex interwoven design at the center of the fabric. Strong lines protecting the weaker ones. Frank felt something shift inside him, a knot of guilt and shame that had been lodged in his chest since Proxima Station beginning to loosen. He looked at this alien child and her mother, both now looking at him not with the desperate hope of earlier, but with something like trust. "What will you do at Uran's Hope?" he asked, suddenly realizing he had no plan beyond getting them safely off Citadel 9. Varelion considered the question. "Uran's Hope is a frontier outpost. They care less about official documentation there. We might find passage further into the Rim territories, perhaps to one of the new colonies where Aliyah can grow up in safety." She hesitated, then added, "What will you do? Return to Citadel 9? The question caught Frank off guard. Return to his tiny office, his meaningless job archiving data no one cared about, his empty existence on a dying station. The thought held no appeal. But what alternative did he have? I don't know, he admitted. I haven't thought beyond getting you both to safety. Come with us, Aaliyah said suddenly, reaching out to touch his hand with her small blue fingers. You can keep protecting us. Frank looked at the child, then at Varelion, who watched him with an unreadable expression. Your mother might have other plans, he said gently. The Rim territories are dangerous, Varelion said slowly. A guide who knows station protocols and human systems would be valuable. She met his eyes directly. And Aaliyah trusts you. That is not a small thing. Frank felt a warmth spreading through him, not the heat of passion that Varelion's initial desperate offer had sparked, but something deeper and more sustaining. Purpose, connection, the possibility of belonging. I'd need to create new identities for all of us, he said, already thinking through the practicalities. Uran's Hope has less stringent verification protocols, but will still need documentation that holds up to basic scrutiny. You can do this? Varelion asked. Frank nodded. I've spent years studying how systems track and verify identities. Creating new ones is just the reverse of that process. For the first time since he'd met her, Varelion smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her alien features into something breathtakingly beautiful. Then we accept your offer of guidance. Frank Mercer. As the transport vessel carried them away from Citadel 9 and toward an uncertain future, Frank felt a peculiar lightness. The weight of his past failure would never completely leave him, but alongside it now was something new, a family forged in desperation and trust, an unexpected second chance. In their cramped hiding place, Aaliyah eventually fell asleep, her head resting against her mother's chest, one small hand still clutching the embroidered fabric that had helped lead to her rescue. Varelion hummed a soft melody, her fingers gently stroking her daughter's hair. Frank watched them, these two alien beings who had crashed into his life and irrevocably changed its trajectory. Through the small viewport near their compartment, the stars stretched into streaks of light as the transport entered hyperspace. Somewhere ahead lay Uran's Hope, and beyond that, possibilities he had never allowed himself to imagine. For the first time in years, Frank Mercer looked toward the future with something approaching hope. Not redemption. Perhaps the child lost on Proxima Station could never be brought back, but a new beginning. A chance to protect rather than archive, to live rather than merely exist. Varelion caught his eye and extended her free hand toward him. After a moment's hesitation, Frank took it, feeling the smooth coolness of her skin against his. In our culture, she said softly, we believe that families are not just born but found, that souls recognize each other across the void. She squeezed his hand gently. Perhaps the universe brought us together for a reason. Frank had never been one for mystical explanations, but as he sat in that humming compartment with Varelion's hand in his and Aaliyah sleeping peacefully beside them, he couldn't deny the feeling that something profound had occurred, that in saving this alien child, he had somehow begun to save himself as well. The transport sped onward through the darkness between stars, carrying its hidden passengers toward a new dawn. And in that moment, surrounded by the gentle hum of engines and the soft breathing of his newfound family, Frank Mercer knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The universe was vast and often cruel, but it also contained unexpected moments of grace, connections forged in the darkest places, hope kindled from desperation's embers, and the chance, always, to begin again.